Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here. My name is Annika Ardel. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator this year as the AmeriCorps member with the Alliance. We're happy to have you all here for our August webinar. And we are excited to have Vanessa Munoz present from Hispanic Access Foundation. We're very grateful to have you here, Vanessa. So with that, I'll hand it over to you. If anybody has any questions, we can put them in the chat and cover them at the end, but feel free to drop them in the chat if you think of something you'd like to ask.
Great. All right, thank you so much, Annika. Hi, everyone. Happy Monday. My name is Vanessa Munoz, and I'm the Conservation Program Manager at Hispanic Access Foundation. And today we'll be talking about closing the nature gap, equity access, and inclusion in the outdoors. Hispanic Access Foundation is a national nonprofit, and our mission is to connect Latinos with partners and opportunities to improve lives and create an equitable society. Our vision is that one day every Hispanic individual in America will enjoy good physical health and a healthy natural environment, a quality education, economic success, and civic engagement in their communities with the sum of improving the future of America. So, to start us off, I'm going to explain what we mean when we talk about the nature gap, and then I'll explain why there is one and why it's a problem. I'm also going to speak about how to close that nature gap and health disparities in people's access to nature, parks, and beaches. So, what is the nature gap? The nature gap refers to the disparities that exist in people's access to parks, beaches, waterways, and natural areas in general. So communities facing the nature gap live in what you might call a concrete jungle or on a degraded land without access to any green or blue spaces nearby, such as parks or the ocean or rivers. On a national scale, we have data showing that a person of color in the US is 3 times more likely to be nature deprived than a white person. Despite this data being based from 2017, we continue to see this problem. And in this image, you can see those statistics based on communities. The story is similar when we look at income differences. Low-income communities are more likely than moderate and high income communities to live in a nature deprived area by about 20 percentage points. And this likelihood is compounded for populations that are both low income and non-white. One of the reality shocking results of this data was that finding that children are more likely twice as likely to be nature deprived. Not only that, non-white families with children are about twice as likely as white families with children to have nature nearby to them. If you can imagine your children growing up without a park or playground nearby, that's the reality for most families with children under 18, and especially non-white families. And we know that nature provides the opportunity to spend time with family and community and build memories. If you're thinking, well, that isn't a problem in my state or in your region, then you're probably wrong. The chart on the right, although it's hard to see or read, shows that these disparities in nature deprivation are almost universal across the 50 states, with exceptions in DC and New Mexico. The nature gap is particularly acute in some regions. In some states in the Northeast, for example, white households are 9 times more likely to have nature nearby than non-white households. And you can see in the map, here we have some hotspots, which are areas in red, where higher proportions of people of color, low-income households, and nature-deprived locations are combined throughout the country. So why is there a nature gap? I also want to talk about why it exists. So as you may be aware, the history of European settlement in the United States is also a history of land theft, dispossession, and forced migration of Native American tribes. So that's one massive factor that has shaped the geography and the ecology of our nation. And when it comes to building our cities, suburbs, and rural communities, the practice of redlining left the US population deeply segregated to this day. And the choice was made to invest in wider communities, to develop and maintain parks and green spaces there, and to neglect communities of color, leaving them without the same amenities and leaving them neglected and unmaintained. On top of that, when it comes to highways, landfills, oil and gas wells, and other infrastructure, the choices was made to place these things away from white communities and often directly on top of communities. And I mean that very literally. And of course, we're still dealing with the legacy of Jim Crow, where Black people were barred from entering parks and beaches and from joining the workforce that maintains our national parks and public lands. While these outright racist policies may not continue today, the effects of this discrimination linger on in policies that allow, for example, wealthy coastal landowners to bar the public from enjoying the beach near their property. And in fact, that our natural resources and conservation workforce remains overwhelmingly white. When we talk about having access to nature, it's not just about having nature nearby. People also have to be able to get there, and to be able to get there and enjoy these spaces and feel welcome with language and cultural accessibility. Some other factors that might limit people from joining might be lack of disability accommodations, lack of personnel who do not accurately represent or look like the community. That feeling of unbelonging in these spaces, and histories that are told throughout the park and place names that reflect colonialism viewpoints. Having nature nearby is the bare minimum for that to happen. And we don't even have that for so many Americans. So there's a lot of work to be done. So why does it matter that communities of color are facing the nature gap? The nature gap matters because having any kind of nature near you, from a single tree to a river to a national park, a national or community park, has so many benefits to communities of color and low-income communities are missing out on. To start with, natural areas allow recreation that promotes active lifestyles. This is so important during normal times. When not enough Americans get physical activity they need every day, it's especially important because outdoor spaces is a safe way to exercise. And actually, Latinos have the highest of adult physical inactivity at 32%, followed by Black at 30%, Indigenous at 29%, and white at 23%. Nature also reduces pollution. This is so incredibly important for a lot of reasons, but especially for communities of color that are more likely to suffer from respiratory diseases due to local pollution. So pollution reduction by way of more nature should be top priority for public health. And air pollution from fossil fuel emissions increases asthma risk and severity. Latinos are twice as likely to go to the emergency room for asthma, and Latino children are twice as likely to die from asthma as white children. Over 3.6 million Latinos suffer from asthma. Again, on that subject of health, having nature nearby reduces stress and can even help with depression and anxiety. It makes you happier, and especially during times of stress, like we saw during COVID. Latinos have the lowest rates of health insurance and hindering their ability to access care when affected by illness or injuries due to lack of nature, other climate impacts. And lastly, greenery provides protection from extreme heats, which most of us are experiencing nowadays, and flooding, both of which we'll see more of due to climate change, and which communities of color are more vulnerable to. So greenery protects from these climate hazards while it also simultaneously absorbs greenhouse gas emissions and mitigates climate change. Due to overuse of materials such as concrete and asphalt, rainfall in many areas is unable to be absorbed by the earth below. Infrastructure such as storm drains and treatment facilities allow the flow of water to be managed. And all of these incredible benefits are missing from so many communities of color and low-income communities and children who see big boost in school performance when they have access to nature. So what are some of the different solutions? How can states help close the nature gap? So what is our role in all of this when it comes to these nature gaps? We have 30 by 30, which I'll dive deep into, a focus on equity and jobs, and climate action. So some policy recommendations, what we need: more nature, closer to home, managed inclusively and locally, accessible and welcoming to all, especially near cities, communities of color, and low-income communities. Overall, what we are recommending can be summarized as more nature, right? Closer to homes, closer to communities of color and low-income communities. How do you get more nature nearby? The 30 by 30 initiative is to protect 30% of our lands and waters by the year 2030. And this has to start at home and our local parks and communities, and it all has to be part of the 30. Center priorities and concentrate resources where they are needed the most, which is in environmental justice, low-income immigrants, and communities of color. Other policy recommendations are hiring and workplace practices. Staff and leadership should reflect the communities they serve, help break down alienation and cultural barriers. You can start by looking inward. So as I mentioned earlier, having nearby nature is necessary, but not sufficient for an accessible, inclusive, and equitable outdoors. In order to get the biggest public health, economic, and other benefits from outdoor spaces, you need people to feel comfortable getting used to and using and enjoying parks. And in order to break down alienation, transportation, and cultural barriers that people of color often encounter in the outdoors, you have to know what those barriers are and how to overcome them. That can start with making sure the agency is truly representative of the community it serves, and strengthening those voices and needs in your planning. So one way you can get started is by making those changes and partnering with us. At Hispanic Access Foundation, we have a workforce known as MANO, which is My Access to Network and Opportunities. And it's this program which places young Latino students and professionals and internships such as the U.S. Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Services, and other conservation-oriented agencies. And we're always looking for new partners who can help find talented BIPOC communities who are looking for internships in these different agencies. And what better way than to get our generations and our future generations involved in these different agencies to be the catalyst of change. And for more information on what MANO is and how you can get involved, you can search manoproject.org. Other policy recommendations are community consultation and engagement, elevating the voices of those that are most impacted. Community consultation and engagement is also really important, so that you're hearing the needs of the people who are impacted and engaging with these different climate issues and nature deprivations. You also have to build trust and demonstrate that you'll follow through. One big example where communities of color have been filled is when it comes to park maintenance. Unmaintened outdoor spaces easily becomes unsafe and unwelcoming outdoor spaces. Another issue is that lack of resources and languages other than English. Oftentimes we have these resources displayed, these interpretive signs that are often only found in English and are not accessible for others who might have those language barriers. The US Latino identity is composed of many narratives. There is not one dominant story that can completely tell the history and contributions of Latinos, nor any particular community or culture in the United States, which is why we need to consult the community directly before making any policy changes to create more nature spaces. The Latino community's overwhelming support for climate action can show our leaders the way forward in ensuring a just transition to an economy that protects our climate, our homes, health, and jobs. And with scientists urging policymakers to protect at least 30% of our US lands and ocean by the year 2030 to address this biodiversity and climate issues and nature gap, Latino voters can pivot and protecting more lands, waters, and oceans over the next decade. With the involvement of Latino communities in environmental policy and other BIPOC communities, we can ensure that every child in the United States has the opportunity to enjoy the benefits of nature, right? Other policy recommendations are involvement, improved consultation with tribal nations, and more opportunities for tribal co-management. So in addition to the fact that we all live and work and recreate on indigenous ancestral lands, the United States is legally required to respect tribal sovereignty, and that includes sovereignty over natural spaces, resources, and access to nature. A lack of meaningful consultation with indigenous groups has been the key driver of nature loss in tribal lands, especially with oil and gas development. Governments should legally recognize indigenous peoples and lands, protect them from extractive industry, and ensure access to lands in accordance with cultural traditions. Indigenous communities must adequately resource and decision-making powers to do this work. And only 17% of global climate and conservation funding intended for indigenous and local communities actually goes to projects led by indigenous people. And indigenous women receive less than a third of that. So access to nature might look different for indigenous communities who have resided on their lands since time immemorial and have been robbed of their day-to-day cultural and spiritual connections to the land and water by colonialism, land theft, and genocide, or are facing those threats today. All indigenous communities are distinct and have distinct practices, historical memories, and statuses with respect to national and local governments. Therefore, indigenous access to nature cannot be granted by implementing one blanket recommendation. While it's tempting to suggest that policies such as land back, which is returning native lands, or co-management of lands, or restoring animal husbandry practices or other methods are the way forward, indigenous sovereignty must be respected. In addition, when indigenous communities are not just consulted, but are actively co-managing conservation lands, such as national monuments, historical sites, studies show the outcomes are better across a wide range of indicators, like biodiversity, ecosystem health, and human health, and economic benefits. So that ecological traditional knowledge passed on by indigenous communities is beneficial to the conservation of our lands for future generations. Other things are education and outreach programs. So education and outreach programs can make outdoor recreation more accessible to families who may not have participated in the outdoors in the past. And involving schools can get broad segment for underserved families in the outdoors. Hispanic Access Foundation has a yearly initiative like Latino Conservation Week, where we organize events that are targeted by and for the Latino community to get people recreating outdoors and making it easy and fun. And actually this year marked our 10th anniversary, where we had over 300 events hosted by individuals and organizations across the nation. Some of our favorite events were Spanish birding, bus tour, trails and tacos hike, tree planting, and we actually had multiple celebratory events hosted in Colorado, San Diego, California, and Philadelphia, and in DC, where different partners and community members gathered to recreate and spend some time in nature. And we frequently partner with state, local, and federal agencies on these events. And if you're interested, we also provide funding. Latino Conservation Week happens every third week of July. And you can find more information at latinoconservationweek.com. You can also become involved by hosting an event or just joining an event. And this website helps you look at different events in your region that you could potentially join or partner up with organizations if you're interested in that. Maybe you're an active entomologist, or you are an active naturalist, and you can host an event in your favorite region or location and make it accessible and free. And we provide also small funding opportunities to make that happen, and to partner with us and create these places more accessible for communities. We also have sorry, my PowerPoint just froze. We also recognize that nature and outdoor recreation is a cross-cutting issue with cross-cutting benefits and implications. PowerPoint, sorry for the technical difficulties, but my next slide was the recognizing nature and outdoor recreation and how it's a cross-cutting issue with cross-cutting benefits and implications. So transportation is really important to this discussion because people of color have lower car ownership rates, meaning that public transit and bike and walking infrastructures can get you more bang for your buck on park accessibility. All people have the right to a healthy environment, including clean air, water, and soil, nearby accessible nature, resilience to nature disasters, and stable climate. And to achieve this, policies and investments must be made to uplift marginalized communities, addressing exclusion and discrimination and correct historic injustices, while also addressing pollution, nature loss, and the climate crisis. Environmental justice cannot be achieved without a social justice, and the connections between sectors must be recognized if systemic racism is to be addressed in conservation in the outdoors. And when I mentioned natural resilience to natural disasters, that is another huge problem that these communities with that fit within that nature gap see, whether it be flooding, whether it be wildfires, whether it be drought. A lot of the times we don't really have the necessary tools to manage and be disaster prepared. And that is another huge thing that we see when it comes to these low-income and BIPOC communities. So we at Hispanic Access Foundation have a variety of tools and white papers on our website. And kind of to learn more about the nature gap and the Latino community, in particular, access to nature, parks, and beaches, I encourage you to take a look at Hispanic Access Foundation's reports. For all of these can be found on our website at hispanicaccess.org. And these toolkits actually help you mobilize and build community. And the data and testimonies from our networks, we have networks such as Latino Climate Council, which is made up of young Latino professionals in the climate crisis world. And we provide a space for them to talk about their different concerns and issues in each region. We also have our OYA, which is Olas y Acción Network, where we have Latino and BIPOC professionals talk about our ocean crisis and water, such as droughts, flooding, and they are different members nationwide that come together in this space and go advocate and provide us with different resources. And they also help develop these different white papers and toolkits. And they essentially become leaders. We also have Por la Creación, which is our faith-based network made up of faith-based leaders who help us in the conservation world and also help with community members and do outreach and advocacy on how we can address this nature gap and how we could improve our policymakers into taking action for the conservation of these different lands that need protection. And then both the data and the testimony from our network leaders, like the three I mentioned, across the country have told us that Latinos feel the climate crisis and challenges to environmental health in many ways, for their children suffering from asthma, to wildfire evacuations, to worries about droughts, extreme temperatures, and flooded streets. It can be affirming for our communities to learn that they are not alone, and that a change in policy can mean a better life for their families. And we want to bring this information to our communities in order to provide those leaders and mobilize Latinos nationally and communities of color. So I encourage you to check out our environmental policy toolkit, our protecting our oceans, and our 10 ways access to nature can bolster biodiversity, communities, and climate report. And some of the statistics I discussed earlier about nature gap and that lack of those disparities between low-income communities and communities of color can be seen in the nature gap inequities in nature access report. And please feel free to email us, or my email is at vanessa@hispanicaccess.org. If you have any questions or want to follow up on anything. I also want to plug in that we have Our Heritage, Our Planet on October 10th through 13th. It's an annual celebration of voices and experiences and storytelling traditions of communities of color in connection to our heritage and our planet. And it's uplifting the nexus between our communities and lands, waterways. And we have different panelists, we have different filmmakers who submit their films, and then we showcase them, because storytelling is a way for us to uplift our voices and our communities and to share our stories of what our community needs are. So thank you so much for providing me the space to talk about nature gap and some of the different policy recommendations, some of the different ways that we can help as a community. And I encourage you all to take some time out of your day and enjoy the outdoors and continue to learn more and find more resources online. And I see also that we have all the links posted in the chat. You can go ahead and visit those, and it has a lot of different information that could be accessible for you on any given day.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. That was great. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask right now? Feel free to speak it or put it in the chat. I was wondering about, you mentioned cultural accessibility, Vanessa, and I was wondering how you, like, what are some ways to increase that, I guess, on a policy level, but also like day-to-day for organizations or regular people?
Of course. So cultural accessibility, when I mentioned that, I was talking about that lack of input from communities that are actually living in those regions, in those specific places. So for example, different national parks or different sites that have been designated and have had a name as a, that could that has a name that could kind of be derived from colonialism, and kind of providing input on the community on what that name might be, provides that opportunity and space for people to feel more welcomed in these places and these spaces in the outdoors.
That makes sense. Thank you. We had another question that was, do you think incorporating the outdoors in education is beneficial? And I guess I'm also kind of curious about maybe ways to elaborate on that and expand that as well.
Of course. So is incorporating the outdoors in education beneficial? I absolutely think that that would be very beneficial for the youth, and to get more information on and access, right? Incorporating this into the kind of the educational system could allow more communities in those children who potentially live in low-income families that don't have accessibility or the resources. Sometimes it's these families that lack that time, that money, that transportation, right? Sometimes these family members, these children might have the beach, maybe like a pretty close to them, like a 5-mile radius, and they've never visited these sites. So it's important to kind of have those resources available because there's multiple factors that don't allow families to visit these natural spaces. And incorporating that into the educational system, or looking for resources and organizations that provide these resources, is crucial to addressing that nature gap. And if you're part of an organization that does community hikes, or that does bird watching, or other educational tools to go outdoors, thank you for all that you do and for allowing that space and opportunity for different communities of color to visit the outdoors.
Great, thank you. Yeah. Do we have any other questions from anybody? Got a quiet group
I'll
today.
follow up with what was just mentioned. So for those of us who do work in those spaces, what are ways that we can target those underrepresented communities versus just generally doing outreach? Like, how can we target those specific audiences to actually attract them to come to those events?
That's a great question. And I feel that oftentimes that is an issue, right? We sometimes create these opportunities and the turnout is very low. I would suggest improving those language barriers, maybe creating resources in Spanish or in other languages that cater to those communities that you're trying to target. Also creating resources that might be more accessible and also fall within those language barriers, right? Making sure that there's representation of those communities that you're trying to target. Sometimes it could be hard, right? Just having people that don't necessarily look like you, and you don't really feel that sense of belonging, or you're not really like comfortable being in those spaces. So having that accessibility and representation, accessibility and resources, and addressing language barriers could really help you drive that event that you're trying to target. And also kind of reaching out to different organizations that might have that similar issue, right? Different organizations that are also trying to host events, or that are trying to be more inclusive of communities of color and getting them into the outdoors and creating events. Which is why I think that Latino Conservation Week, which I mentioned happens every third week of July, is great, because you could find different partners all around you that are hosting events, that are joining events, and you can create those networking opportunities and relationships and partners, and foster them that way.
Great, thank you so much. Any other questions? All right, well, if anybody thinks of anything, I have a couple more minutes, but thank you so much, Vanessa, for joining us today. That was really insightful, and I think really relevant to where we're all at, especially I know we have definitely some people on this meeting today that are also kind of working in this space, so we're excited to be able to share your information and insight. We always, of course, as a nonprofit, are inviting our guests to contribute to the Alliance. We love to be able to provide these webinars for free, and I know donations are not always easy to come by, but if anybody has the ability to donate today, that would be great. Grace is going to drop the donate link in the chat as well, but that's just SierraNevadaAlliance.org/donate. Yeah, if anybody has any other questions, like I said, feel free to let us know. We also like to try to keep these presentations as relevant and effective as possible. So we also have an evaluation form that we'd love for you to fill out. We'll also be sending it out by email within the week. and also putting this webinar online. So if you got here late or had to leave early or anything like that, you can go and watch it on our website. Like I said, I'll be emailing that to all attendees and registrants later in the week. But we really appreciate if you can fill out that evaluation form. It really helps us kind of make these presentations better as much as we can. Yeah, thank you so much for everyone for attending, and thank you so much, Vanessa, for sharing time with us. We really appreciate it. We're excited that everyone was here. Yeah, I'll be sending out the links that we talked about today. We'll send out Vanessa's email address. So if anybody thinks of any questions, feel free to reach out later. And yes, we appreciate you all showing up.
Great. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your week.